If I speak like this, can you all hear okay? Is that all right? I want to thank the organisers very much for inviting me to what has been, and the bit I've attended, which hasn't been enough, but a very stimulating conference. And I want to thank all of you too for staying till the end to hear me, because I think it has been actually quite a long, albeit stimulating experience over the 2 days. So thank you for coming. I'm very nervous because I think quite a lot of what I'm going to say, judging by what's going on, is going to be a little controversial, to say the least, but maybe that's all to the good. And it's going to be fairly general. I'm not an eco-critic, I'm not a literary critic, I'm a philosopher by training, so it's going to be a fairly general kind of approach that I'm taking, with some programmatic forms of illustration of what I'm going to say more theoretically at the beginning. Eco-criticism has been viewed as an engagement with literary texts that themselves constitute nature writing. In other words, that explicitly seek to invoke the qualities of the natural world, animate or inanimate, and reflect upon those qualities. It's also been viewed as an engagement with texts for what they reveal about human relations with the natural environment and or with other living beings. And it has been viewed as a reading of texts that focus on drawing out the enlightenment they shed, or the lessons we can draw from them about eco-politics and the directions it should take today. These are differing orientations rather than mutually exclusive interpretations, and their concerns are to some extent overlapping. But I myself am certainly in general agreement with Greg Gerard's call for a move away from what he calls the poetics of authenticity, with its focus on the redemptive qualities of an unmediated encounter with nature, to a poetics of responsibility, much more centred on culture and human action. And I therefore here want to offer some reasons for favouring the third construction of eco-criticism's task that I've listed, and to provide some illustration of how I see it most fruitfully contributing to eco-politics. But as a way of setting the context for the illustrative part of the talk, I want to begin with some fairly general remarks on the current context of eco-philosophy. The discrimination around the concept of nature that's been prompted in recent decades by the growth in environmental concern is now reflected in a very complex and ramifying set of discourses. But in a very broad brush way, we can distinguish, I think, between two main tendencies. On the one hand, in the course to revalue nature as a site of intrinsic value, to recognise our kinship and continuity with other living beings, and to abandon anthropocentric conceptions of humanity's privileged place within the ecosystem, we've been witness to what can be termed a nature-endorsing tendency. Nature endorsers lament the loss or erosion of nature, emphasise human dependency on the planetary ecosystem, and demand that we acknowledge environmental limits and the confines they impose on human activity. As a counter to this, on the other hand, although sharing some of the naturalistic arguments on human-animal affinities, the constructivist tendency emphasises the formation or mediation of human culture in whatever comes to count as nature or natural. Strongly influenced by recent developments in the fields of genetics and information technology and by post-structuralist theory, this approach is sceptical of any redemptionist appeal to nature's powers, while also often celebrating the breakdown of clear-cut distinctions between artifice and nature, organic and inorganic, as an emancipatory advance, as freeing us from the confines of supposedly natural sexualities or modes of being and so on. Both sides to this debate, in my opinion, have important things to say and need to be heard. But both too, as I've argued in my writings on nature, often fail to distinguish adequately between differing invocations of the idea of nature, or to explore the coherence of their normative implications. The endorsers, for example, in one aspect of their argument invite us to believe that humanity is part of nature and call upon us to get back to it or to re-cement our links with it. Yet nature is also at the same time presented by them as that domain which is definitionally independent of us, but now ruined or largely lost through human intrusion upon it and contamination of it. And to add further to the confusion, the natural environment is often identified in these arguments with parts of the landscape that are the outcome of centuries of human agricultural activity, and in that sense at least as culturally contaminated as the most built-up environments. In its political implications too, the hands-off nature approach to conservation, encouraged by the endorsing perspective, has sometimes proved too ready to give preference to wilderness preservation for the eco-tourists over the welfare of indigenous peoples, or too quick to make humanity in general responsible for an environmental destruction associated primarily with the pursuits of Western-style affluence. At its most extreme, it can license the totalitarian control of human population advocated by some adherents of deep ecology. The constructivist position, on the other hand, is at risk of denying or abstracting from environmental pressures altogether. The treatment of nature as a continuously revisable signifier does little to address material damage to the environment, nor does the unqualified stress on socialization give the recognition to the nature that grounds bioscience and environmental change and always constrains the forms of their intervention. After all, even the most sophisticated experiments in genetic modification are dependent for success on pre-given biological process. The same holds for the larger scale forms of human interaction with the environment, where there is always a distinction to be drawn between the powers and processes which are the essential precondition of all agricultural practice on the one hand, and the humanly modified landscape and its plant and animal life on the other. In this sense, there's always a nature that is not the construct of human culture and technology, but the primary condition and context of any cultural intervention and manipulation in the first place. In an attempt to correct for the respective shortcomings of both endorsing and constructivist arguments, I myself have defended a position on nature that I describe as both realist and humanist, and I know what a bad term humanism is regarded as in this context, but I'll explain a bit more in a moment about mine. It's realist in the sense that it recognizes the contrast between an independent nature, conceived as the permanent ground of all human bioactivity and environmental change, and the lay or surface or more phenomenological concept of nature, in other words, the use of the term nature with which we refer to the empirically observable and always historically changing and culturally conditioned life forms and environmental effects. It's humanist, on the other hand, in the sense that although it recognizes human continuity with other species, it runs counter to the argument of those who would assimilate human patterns of need and consumption to those of other animals, rather than highlighting critical differences and the role of these differences, which are very often negative, actually, and not to be applauded, but they are differences, and the role of these differences both in creating and potentially in resolving ecological crisis. It is human ways of living, after all, much in contrast to the cyclical and more reproductive mode of existence of other creatures that are wrecking the planet, and humans alone who are really in some kind of position to do something about it, if anyone is. In this connection, I've emphasized what I term human biological underdetermination relative to other species, and the range of choice of action that is therefore in principle available to us. The current ecological situation, I argue, is better illuminated not by reference to the intrinsic qualities of non-animate nature, nor by recalling us to our fundamental kinship with other living creatures, but by confronting the distinctively human appetite for innovative forms of cultural transcendence and individualizing self-expression. Viewed in that light, the key ecological problem is whether we can find ways of living rich, complex, creative, non-repetitive lives without social injustice and without environmental damage. This is not about how better to respect or get back to nature in the sense of reverting to tradition and a simpler way of life, but how to advance to a form of future that is both assertively human and ecologically benign. The focus, in short, should fall less on the adoption of the right attitudes to or ways of valuing nature, and more on the conditions of human fulfillment and how these can be secured in an ecologically sustainable mode. I take issue, in short, with those, and they are, or have been, quite well represented among eco-critics, who think environmental politics has more to do with appreciating nature than with revising ideas about what counts as progress, prosperity, and human flourishing. In the same spirit, I question the adequacy of an eco-critical approach that points to some Spinozan or Deleuzian unity and play of forces as linking us all into an endlessly interconnected universe. This is not so much because I think it's ontologically mistaken, but because I think it invites too much fatalism and positivism of approach. To point out that we are all interconnected in nature and share much with other animals, much more with other animals than we previously thought, is all very well. But what is important eco-politically is recognition both of the role of humanity in bringing about ecological collapse and of the distinctive capacities humans alone have to monitor and, in principle, adjust their behaviour and environmental impact. Such arguments, of course, presuppose specifically human demands for self-realisation and self-expression, and the capacities of reason, language use, imagination, and so forth, needed to act on those demands. They're committed, in short, to human exceptionalism of a kind that has been challenged by some forms of post-humanist argument. I say some because I accept a good deal of the Nietzschean, Marxian, Freudian, and more recently, post-structuralist critique of the humanist subject conceived as an autonomous and epistemologically self-transparent agent of history. Human persons, like other creatures, are subject to trans-individual systemic processes and pressures, notably today market forces, which are now always spoken of as an independent agent of human destiny. But there is also, of course, the more usually cited examples of language and other semiotic systems that are presupposed to forms of consciousness and communication rather than purely expressive tools of them. And these structures, though note they are humanly created rather than naturally dictated, are indeed in many ways beyond our ken or control. Post-humanists are right in that sense to point to the ways in which modes and the very means of communication are involved in what it means to be human at any given point in time. I would also, on the issue of human-animal relations, endorse a good part of the argument of those. They include Derrida, Cora Diamond, Donna Haraway, Carrie Wolf, and so on, who want to problematize the discourse of rights in its application to non-human animals on the grounds that it rests on an inadequate conception of justice. In other words, on one that fails to see that what generates our moral response to animals and their treatment is not some distanced and impartial calculation of what consideration is rightfully due to them, but rather our sense of the mortality and vulnerability we share with them, and the compassion that goes with that. But it's precisely with a view to sustaining the philosophical coherence of this kind of position, with its appeal to the distinctive role of human imagination and empathy in generating moral response, that we need to defend human exceptionalism. Derek Mine, Riley asks in his poem, I'm not going to read it all, but it's all up there for you, The Mute Phenomena, what we know, as he puts it, of the revolutionary theories advanced by turnips, or the sex life of cutlery. And he goes on to suggest that already in a lost hubcap is conceived the ideal society which will replace our own. It's a very nice conceit. But if we more seriously question whether we should continue to privilege human intellectual and emotional capacities in our dealings with other forms of beings, then we are at risk of subverting the range of normative distinctions without which there would seem little point in moving the critique in the first place. In the ecological thought, Tim Morton argues that we should not, as he puts it, set up consciousness as yet another defining trait of superiority over non-humans. Humans, he argues, are fairly uniquely good at throwing and sweating, and that's about all. But to belittle what is distinctive to us in this way is also, I think, to undermine the idea of the human person as enjoying any special claim to self-realization. If Morton is white, why is he writing books? Or why should we find the idea of the clone morally problematic? Or think of cloning as distraining on our human species being? And the issue becomes even more acute in relation to machines. Even those who would have us blur the mind-machine conceptual division have argued for it on the basis of the quasi-mind possession and ensouled qualities of advanced computerization. But if these capacities or attributes are themselves regarded as problematic because they are rooted in some regrettably humanist endorsement of human powers of cognition and reflexivity, in some preferring of minds and souls, then why should the approximations of artificial intelligence to human capacities be afforded any special attention in the post-humanist context? So, from my point of view, post-humanism subverts itself if it attempts to go beyond human exceptionalism altogether. And the most persuasive of the post-humanist discourses are those which are prepared to recognize and talk about the lurking humanism of the forms of questioning of the nature and limits of the human that are opened up through the post-humanist project. Because in the last analysis, the rhetorical address of the post-human only makes sense as an appeal to the imagination or moral sensibility of those already within the human community, even if it invites a reappraisal of the confines or self-imaging of that community. As Stanley Cavell has suggested, what is so human is that we share the fact with other animals, that animals are also our others, that we are animals. Being struck with this is something one might call seeing us as human. It is a feeling of wonder. This just for light relief. It follows from my emphasis on the importance of rethinking human prosperity rather than the nature of nature, that global environmental problems have to be recast as problems of consumption, and in a twofold and interconnected way. Firstly, there's the problem of the huge disparity between rich and poor in their access to resources, and hence to the minimum of material conditions essential to any further flourishing. Redressing this imbalance, I would argue, is both a moral and pragmatic imperative, a demand not only of social justice, but a prerequisite of any long-term global ecological survival. These are just a few images drawn from Mike Davis's work. This is the way it's going for some, and these are the evil paradises of hyper-consumerism that he described in the book he wrote with Daniel Weston. I'll leave it there. So what is needed, the other problem, is that of consumerism. The problem, namely that human flourishing is currently so widely perceived, both by those in a position to enjoy it, hitherto mainly affluent people in the West, and by those who lack the means to do so, as dependent on an ever-enhanced consumption of material goods and luxury services. The two problems connect in the sense that pressures for a more egalitarian distribution of global resources are unlikely to be applied unless and until the good life is reconceived along less consumerist lines. In the absence, that's to say, of a seductive and compelling alternative to existing patterns of affluent consumption and commodity-dependent forms of self-expression and self-realization, it will prove extremely difficult to provide a better deal either for the environment and its non-human life forms or for those less privileged within the human community. So what's needed here, I think, is a new political imaginary that would draw on the social complexity and reflexivity of the globalized era in order to break with the assumption that enlightened policies on race, gender, and human rights can only be carried on the back of conventional economic growth and its shopping mall culture. It would also offer a very different, secular but less materialist conception of human flourishing as dependent on the shortening of the working week, the expansion of free time, slower and less stressful modes of transport, and more evolved and universally available educational and aesthetic pleasures, rather than on enhanced productivity, stressed out work routines, and ever-expanding material acquisition. This, for me, is where the humanities in general have most to offer. Not only can they help to promote a cultural revolution in our thinking about human pleasure and personal fulfillment, they can also provide the pedagogic resources to allow people in a future greener society better to enjoy a materially reproductive and therefore slower paced and less time-scarce mode of existence. And it's against the background of this general sketch of the potential contribution of the humanities to the reconceptualization of the politics of prosperity that I want now to return, and it will have to be very cursorily, in the remainder of my talk, to some exemplification of how it might shift the focus of literary eco-criticism. My illustrations, as I said, are going to be very programmatic, since I'm offering no more than pointers to some possible readings, but won't be in a position to explore any of them in detail here. The two main considerations determining my selection of texts is, firstly, as you'll expect from what I've already said, that they offer insights on human consumption and the politics of the good life, and secondly, that they are sensitive to the humanity-nature dialectic, and in particular to the need to recognize both the rationale for the critique of capitalist modernity and the limitations of a naive nostalgia for earlier and supposedly greener ways of living. And for my first example, I'm going back actually to Shakespeare, and particularly to King Lear, a play which, along with others, of course, by Shakespeare, has figured centrally in commentary on Shakespeare's ideas of nature, perhaps most seminally in John Danby's early study. But mine would be an approach that did not go to the play for its green imagery or for its cosmological and human parallels, nor even, as Gabriel Egan has recently, for its foreshadowing of chaos and fractal theory and the new genetics, but rather for its insights into the tensions between tradition and progress, and above all on the politics of need. As many have pointed out, the play turns on contrasting normative conceptions of nature, a two-way allegory in which different ways of being human are figuring different ways of responding to nature, and vice versa. This applies both environmentally in the actual and metaphoric contrast between wild and cultivated nature, the nature of weeds and rank growth versus the husbandly nature of agriculture, but also to human affairs in the contrast between the orthodoxy of a benign and biddable nature as represented by Lear, Gloucester, Albany and Kent, and the rebellious nature that is indifferent to social order and customs and registered primarily in the figures of Edmund, Donald and Reagan. On the one hand, then, we have respect for tradition, hierarchy, conventional sexual mores and family values. On the other, the individualizing, self-seeking and modernizing values of the Edmund camp. And whether or not one follows Danby in seeing Cordelia as registering the possibility of redemption from this conflictual tension, the tension itself and the suggestion of the play that we need to find a way to surpass it is surely of some relevance to thinking through our responses to the contemporary ecological situation, where we need to avoid both complacent endorsement of tradition with its supposedly naturally ordered hierarchical community and values on the one hand, but also the unqualified pursuit of progress, modernity and relentless individualism on the other. Or in Raymond Williams' terms quoted in my title, where we need to avoid both what he calls a simple backward look with its patrician and patriarchal forms of nostalgia, and the simple progressive thrust with its unthinking adulation of entrepreneurial activity and progress. In its commentary on needs, the play complies with this demand, both in the counsel it seems to offer for some Aristotelian mean between overly luxurious provision and the mere survivalism of the unaccommodated bare-forked animal, and in its dialectical insight on the question of true need, where it recognizes the importance in human affairs of always questioning what is truly needed for humans to prosper, while at the same time acknowledging the impossibility of ever pronouncing upon that truth in some final essentialist manner. As Lear famously puts it in his response to Reagan's asking why he needs so extensive a retinue, "Oh, reason not the need, our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature's needs, man's life is cheap as beef. Thou art a lady, if only to go warm or gorgeous, why nature needs not what thou gorgeous wearest, which scarcely keeps thee warm. But for true needs, you heavens, give that patience I need." True need, Lear implies here, cannot be finally agreed upon because all attempts to define it are either misleadingly restrictive or vacuously uninformative. To reduce human needs to a brutish minimum is no more helpful than to justify the necessity of every luxury. If we restrict our needs today to barest essentials, it will lead to the absurdity of claiming that bread and water are alone truly needed, while bread factories and antibiotics are luxuries. When employed vacuously, on the other hand, it will result in the claim that everything we currently consume and the entire system of their production and delivery are all equally needed. Our true needs are more than a matter of basic biology, and both more and less than what we actually consume. Deciding then on the truth of human needing will always involve some choosing, positing of value of a certain way of life as better than another. It is not something that can be read off from some set of facts about human nature or imputed to you as in your true interest by some supposedly objective set of experts claiming to know better than you do what you truly need. The essential point here concerns the complexity of a distinctively human consumption, its irreducible symbolic dimensions, and the difficulties of specifying some supposedly naturally determined set of true needs of the kind implicit in simplistic denunciations of the supposed falsity of consumerist provision. At the same time, however, there is no chance of a greener future unless we put to ourselves this question of true need and place the politics of a true prosperity much more at the centre of our environmental concerns. Precisely the moves that most of our mainstream politicians are most reluctant to do now. Let me turn now very briefly to a second example, one that's also figured prominently in eco-criticism, namely Romanticism. The English Romantic poets have rightly been valued by eco-critics for their nature writing, and they've been read as revelatory of an authentic way of being in harmony with nature. My own reading, and I'm not going to develop it here, but it would emphasise instead the dialectical aspects of Romanticism's approach to the nature-culture divide and its ongoing critique or subversion of its own yearnings for immersion in nature. It would also note the role that Romanticism, in a broad sense, can play in the revisions of thinking about pleasure and the good life that I've argued are crucial to the furtherance of a greener political agenda. In defence of the first point, I'd suggest that Romantic poetry is almost always pointing us beyond a simplistic endorsement of nature or simple message about our alienation from it. It's true that it summons the otherness of nature and celebrates its independence, but even as it does so, it also recalls us to the culturally mediating role of the summons and to the extent of the dependence of the aesthetic response to nature on its human representation. And that, I think, is a particular characteristic of Wordsworth's poetry, but I'm not going to go into any detail here. I've written elsewhere about it in a piece that's coming out shortly. The only point I might make here in this connection is to compare this way of looking dialectically at Romanticism to Adorno's claim in his aesthetic theory that even as nature transcends expression, anyone capable of experiencing its beauty feels compelled to speak as a way of signalling the momentary liberation it affords from the confines of the enclosure within the perceiving and representing self. The aesthetic appreciation of natural beauty also, Adorno argues, recollects a world without domination. It acts as a kind of reminder of, or utopian gesture towards a world in which humanity would enjoy a harmonious and egalitarian existence. But this romance too is paradoxical. Not only is this a world that almost certainly never existed, so that any recollection of it could only be a fantasy, there is the further consideration that it is, as he puts it, through this recollection that experience dissolves back into that amorphousness out of which genius arose and for the first time became conscious of the idea of freedom that could be realized in the world of domination. Harmonious immersion in nature, in other words, is incompatible with the human consciousness that comes to an understanding of freedom and desires the release from domination. Romanticism, as I suggested, construed in this more dialectical way, can also, I think, offer resources for an alternative hedonist critique of consumerism. Romantic reflection on vanished or vanishing times and spaces is one such resource, since it's a form of retrospection that offers us a model for reconnecting with the tradition of acknowledged and lamented, if also always cognitively transcended forms of loss. And in that connection, I've coined the idea of an avant-garde nostalgia, which is obviously a provocatively contradictory notion, but I invoke it in order to capture a movement of thought that remembers and mourns what's irretrievable from the past, but also attains to a more complex political wisdom and energy in the memorializing process itself. And here, I think, the key figure is Rowan Williams and his readings, particularly in The Country and the City, and maybe particularly of Thomas Hardy. But there's also, it's also a theme of many of the, or some at any rate, of the Frankfurt School thinkers who have also insisted on the importance of remembrance to revolutionary progress. Adorno has, I'm not going to read it out because of time, I'll just leave it up, but the general point he's making is about this dialectical, you know, we need to, rationalization is not that rational, he says, the universality of mediation is yet to be transformed into living life, and this endows the traces of immediacy, however dubious and antiquated, with the element of corrective justice. If today the aesthetic relation to the past is poisoned by a reactionary tendency with which this relation is in league, an ahistorical aesthetic consciousness that sweeps aside this dimension of the past as rubbish is no better. Without historical remembrance there would be no beauty. This emphasizes the importance of the backward look even as it acknowledges its fantastical dimension and the impossibility and undesirability of an unmediated return to past experience. Herbert Marcuse likewise acknowledged, as he puts it, that the romantic pre-technical world was permeated with misery, toil and filth, and these in turn were the background of all pleasure and joy. But he also at the same time lamented, as he put it, a landscape, a medium of libidinal experience which no longer exists. And all these theorists would have us see what is truly progressive as in some sense lying beyond these antitheses. Implicit today, I would argue, in the diverse range of contemporary laments over lost spaces and communities, the commercialization of children, the vocational shifts in education, the ravages of development, the cloning of our cities and so forth, is a romantically accented hankering for a society that can reclaim the libidinal experience of the past without sacrificing some of the very real gains of modernity. Diffused and unfocused though these laments may be, they speak to a now quite widely felt sense of the opportunities that have been squandered in recent decades for acceding to a fairer, less harassed, less environmentally destructive and more enjoyable existence. And lastly, and even more cursorily, let me just say a word on the potential contribution of more contemporary literature, since here too, of course, there is much interesting work exposing the more nightmarish aspects of modern consumer culture, and even some that can be said to be signalling the more rewarding libidinal experience that could be enjoyed in a post-consumerist society. Michel Houellebecq's Atomized and Platform, for example, sorry, it's going wrong, never mind, are novels about technocultural sex and metropolitan sex tourism that are all the more unsettling because their narratives are so co-optively one-dimensional, as uncritical of the quasi-pornographic and narcissistic pleasures they relate, as consumer culture is more generally of its shopping mall enticements. The critical knife is surely inserted in these novels, but only by making the reader all too uncomfortably aware of the power of dominant culture to subvert the critique. Martin Ryle's recent reading of Houellebecq's fiction and Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake as contemporary engagements with a brave new world dystopia are very instructive in this respect, and if you haven't seen them, they're in green letters. Even more relevant to an alternative hedonist eco-criticism is Ryle's commentary on Ali Smith's The Accidental, a novel which charts the ecologically sensitive intervention and erotic impact of the mythico-magical amber on a stylish middle-class family. Describing it as a neo-pastoral intervention in current culture and politics, Ryle argues that it represents how we both, to quote, know and deny that we are facing an ecological crisis of perhaps disastrous proportions. It's a novel that indicts the complacent retrospections, the simple backwards thrust, the simple backwards look, I beg pardon, in other contemporary fictions that focus on earlier moments of history, notably the current obsession with World War II, but avoid any serious engagement with the role of the oil economy and consumerism in creating our current crises and our new wars. But in contrast to the dystopian fictions of Atwood and Houellebecq, this is a novel that also gestures towards redemption by summoning the more erotic and sensual pleasures that a greener life could provide. Even as it dispenses with any straightforward pastoral lament for the past, it distances itself from any postmodernist celebration of cyborgism and our mobile and internet-dominated ways of relating to the world. So, to conclude, a cultural revolution in our thinking about consumption and the good life is now widely accepted, I think, as a condition of warding off the worst consequences of global warming, regardless of any other attractions it may have. But it takes a different kind of imagination and shift of moral and aesthetic focus to see that even were it ecologically possible to sustain consumerism forever and to extend the shopping mall culture to all parts of the planet and maybe beyond, that would not be a relief, but a curse, a blight rather than a blessing. Literary texts and critical readings of them that can offer this form of dialectical insight into the displeasures of the consumer lifestyle and its possible transcendence can help to keep alive that needed imagination. Thank you.
Fantastic, and we have to end a little tiny bit early, but we do have time for a few questions from the floor. So, who'd like to start off?
No question.
Athens, thank you.
Here are some dystopian images of the good life. Well, of a particular kind of humanism. I mean, a qualified humanism, quite heavily qualified humanism.
Yeah. I wondered where, you mentioned empathy a couple of times, and it seems to be, therefore, humanistic empathy, an ethics of care. So I just wondered where you stand on recent developments on the question of an ethics of care. Chris Soper uses the phrase an ethics of flourishing, you use the word flourishing, and then there are others like Sanders talks about the kind of philosophy of citizenship, moving away from care into justice. So how do you see
Yes.
around this?
I mean, I'm not terribly familiar with some of the work you're mentioning, so I wouldn't want to kind of answer as if I were. I mean, where I mentioned empathy in particular, I was in connection with my acceptance of a certain critique of the human rights kind of argument associated with Reagan and Singer, and that's to say, in the sense that one has to recognise, I think, that our relations to other animals are indeed coloured by, considerations of our. They are essentially, insofar as we are actually feeling empathy for them. It's an empathy that's conditioned by what we share in common in terms of vulnerability and so on. I think it's a very difficult set of issues to decide whether. Whether the basis for our relation to other. I think it's a different issue in relation to non-human animals than it is to ourselves. I mean, I would be very reluctant to go towards a sort of ethics of care as the basis for our thinking about interhuman relations. I think it's more. I think I'd want to defend it more readily in relation to other non-human animals, because it doesn't seem to me easy to draw up a sort of basis in which justice would be the key issue in our dealings with our animals. Because I think, from my point of view, it seems to me that you're in a domain of justice only where the other is also recognising the comparable, is recognising the need for just action itself, and that's not going to apply in the case. But that doesn't, of course, mean that there's no basis for treating them without cruelty, or for treating them well, for treating them with great sympathy, with empathy, So I mean, that's only a sketch of an answer, but I think that would be the line in which I'd want to go, but I need to read more.
Well, as ever, a really inspiring talk, and thank you for that. I was wondering if, when you began to talk about a new political imaginary that would be a way of imagining alternative ideas of human fulfillment, one might be about to bring the love of nature back in, and a part of me would hope that we would, at least as part of the range of things that meet that fulfillment.
It's because of the love of nature that we need to rethink our consumption.
Yeah, absolutely. But more than that, I wonder if you're beginning to reconfigure a kind of literary humanism of the kind that, of course, was pretty well banished from most critical discourse about 20 years ago, particularly a kind of evaluative criticism that doesn't shrink from giving an evaluative account of human experience and human need. I mean, how do we know what it is that fulfills?
Sorry, did you want to say more?
No, well, that's it.
I mean, again, it's a very good question. I mean, I think what I'm suggesting is a reading that looks. I mean, can we call it eco-critical? But I mean, a kind of eco-critical reading that would actually be interested in text for the ways they reflect. They reflect on the difficulties of finally pronouncing on the nature of human flourishing or the nature of human prosperity. I mean, I'm very, my whole argument around the concept of alternative hedonism has been designed to avoid the accusation of moralising about human needs. And I don't commit to a true-false idea of, I'm very loath to sort of go down that road. And hence I've wanted to emphasise in the more social science aspect of the argument the way in which it's based in or emerging forms of disaffection. I actually invoke Raymond Williams's concept of the structure of feeling, where there are feelings, there are latent, ill-expressed, feelings coming through of dissatisfaction with the consumerist definitions of the good life. But these themselves can then root and legitimate the critique in a way, so that it becomes an imminent critique on the part of people themselves rather than one that's imposed on them. And I think that same sensibility needs to be at work in the reading of literary texts or in the creation of artwork or whatever it might be that could contribute to this new political imaginary. I mean, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact how difficult it is to pronounce finally. I mean, that was what I was trying to sketch, and it was much too sketchy in the reading of Lear's speech, because it seems to me that what's going on there is quite important in its sensitivity to that issue. But what is insensitive in modern politics is the failure to even begin to have that set of dilemmas put to us. So, in a way, I think it would be interesting to see. It's not going back to a form of humanism that is rooted in some naturalistic sense of what we need and what counts as flourishing. I'm not really an Aristotelian in that sense. I'm kind of not a utilitarian either, but I'm not. I can see the pros and cons of both sides here, and so it will be that kind of sensitive readings. I mean, I don't think literary texts or artworks should be charged with producing that kind of information, even if I thought it would be you know, we don't want a brave new world kind of way of thinking about our needs and our pleasures, but we do need to, I think a green future is going to depend on us confronting these sets of issues more directly and finding ways to explore them more fully as people involved in the humanities. I see that as an important role now. And it's completely at one, I think, with so much of the work that people are doing around the concept of, you know, in terms of, you know, of nature, of you know, the more conventional forms of eco-critical engagement, some of which, of course, have been represented today. It's completely constant. I mean, they're all part of the cultural revolution, as I see it. I'm just putting in the or here for some emphasis also on consumption. You know.
Did you have a question?
It's that time of day. I won't remember the answer, so don't worry.
Well, to state the very obvious, one of the attractions of what you're saying, of the cultural politics you're advocating, is that exactly the same questions are raised increasingly unavoidably by the economic crisis in which we find ourselves.
Yeah.
And another contemporary fiction that's a critique of consumerism is Mr. Phillips by John Manchester, who's also written
I haven't
very
read that.
lucidly
I've
and
read
very
his other stuff. Yeah, I've read.
very lucidly and very angrily about the brats.
Yeah. No, he's quite an interesting figure. Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, again, yeah, someone could do some work on that. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very fascinating talk. So again, I'd like to thank you for that, Kate. I just feel rather depressed at the end of the conference to think about the problems that we face in bringing to the attention of a wider world the sorts of issues that we've all been talking about here. And you mentioned just now the insensitivity of modern politics to the environmental question. And I don't know quite how we confront, we have a duty to try to confront, how we might successfully confront politicians who are unwilling to admit, even if they can see, that there is an environmental problem. Because if they do so, they will lose their jobs, they will lose the positions of power that they have. And the economic crisis is totally dominating the politics of the powerful nations of the world. Even in the case of environmental tourism that might awaken people to a problem. And this summer I went to Yellowstone Park and I saw the herd of bison that's been built up from the few that were left a century ago. Huge problem at the moment because farmers outside the park don't want those bison going down onto their land in the winter, and bison naturally do what bison do, which is move down to lower lands when the weather becomes cold. They want the tourism, they don't want the bison on the land. That's a kind of particular example. It's turned into a whole political hot potato. It dominates the politics at the moment in northern Wyoming, Montana and Idaho. But how do we as critics and as public intellectuals and as teachers of the next generation of people who will take up this critique actually persuade politicians and people who are unwilling to realise there's a problem, to acknowledge that there is, and rethink these issues? It's a difficult one and a very depressing.
It is. I mean, it is a very difficult issue. And I mean, I think at the heart of the problem really is something called the growth economy, actually, because it's the last thing. I mean, it is incredible, Shivler. I mean, we cannot talk about the importance of going beyond a commitment to the growth economy. If you do so, you're trying to get out of straitjacket. I mean, it's, you know, our whole economic and political life across the mainstream spectrum is dominated by the idea of the importance of growth and of getting back to growth. I mean, it is. And even someone like John Lancaster, for example, in the current issue of the London Review of Books, is still thinking in these kinds. I noticed that George Monbiot finally decided he could come out in favour of a sort of prosperity without growth position finally. I mean, we need. I mean, somehow we need to be able to move this idea of contesting the growth economy much more into the central sort of domain of respectable thinking, respectable political ideas. I mean, Tim Jackson and his prosperity without growth has actually had some impact. It's been quite good to see that, but it's still regarded as nearly nutty. I'm regarded as nearly nutty for sort of contesting the idea of the growth economy, especially in the context of the current economic crisis and so on. I mean, I don't think, we're back with a familiar problem in a way. I mean, I don't think we are going to resolve the environmental crisis in any but a fairly ecologically barbaric way if we stay stuck to capitalist globalization and the growth economy model. How we turn that around is the big problem, and I think the only contribution I can make is to think in terms of the necessary precondition of having what I'm calling a kind of cultural revolution, and there I think ordinary people could actually be more galvanized around images of an alternative way of living. I mean, one of the problems we've got is that everything is, a whole set of images of the good life, of pleasure, of libidinal delight, of sexual eroticism and so on, is dominated by the advertising model. I mean, we haven't, attempting to put across other ways of living, other forms of pleasure, other conditions of happiness, and then we've got to link those up to the global conditions of exploitation and injustice as well. It is very difficult. We have very few resources, and they are, everything is done to try to shut that down. So it's a difficult one, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying, I suppose. It's complex, yeah.
I think I'm going to have to finish
sorry.
because we are out of time, but I think we could all just thank Kate again for her. And just while I've got you all captive, I just very quickly wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody who has taken part in the conference. All the speakers, the 4 plenary speakers, the 2 respondents to our 2 video papers, everybody here at Queen Mary who's made the conference possible, the University of Lincoln and ASLI for funding the conference and giving us the opportunity to put it on in the first place. So thanks very much. We've really enjoyed putting the conference together, and I think I can speak for both Kate and Sam to say that we've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and we hope that you have too. And we will be going to the pub after this, which I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear after a very busy couple of days. And we're meeting outside the venue.
I'd like to thank 3 of you. You've done a fantastic job.